There are those who would like to do something about what you might call harmful elements in any society. They might say want to do something to advocate for those who are suffering. Some would prefer to use the term oppressed, abused, victims, but I wish generally to stay away from those terms. But at any rate, to want to say something, do something to promote, shall we say, good, the value of empathy and how it plays out, to encourage more of it, and to say things about elements that do not encourage this, shall we say. But then what stops so much dead in its tracks, such that maybe a Me Too movement is started, but then the creator goes down the tubes all too often with various hateful accusations? Or what happens if some laws are passed, but hearts are not changed as to what you might call certain stigmas still out there, or certain prejudice, shall you say, certain hateful attitudes. Certain laws may be passed, but that doesn't mean things have changed much. We may even take certain people we've venerated, supposedly having made progress in society, and create holidays for them, and issue stamps on their behalf, and give Nobel Prizes. But has this actually done much? If so, why do we have so many massive social problems still? Massive. In fact, one person who talks quite a bit about character, in his 70s now, Dr. George Simon Jr., a PhD holder in psychology, has, as a Christian, I believe, he has been talking quite a bit about character. He says it's the defining issue in our times, and that during the age of Freud it was neurosis, but now it's poor character. So if this is so, why is it so hard to change things? Now, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi from India, who had a massive influence on changes with the British ruling in India at one time, had said this, amongst other things: I shall not submit to injustice from anyone. I shall conquer untruth by truth, and in resisting untruth I shall put up with all suffering. Now my question then is, if this is true, that untruth can be conquered by truth, why does that seem not to play out very often? And why, in fact, are activists so often what you might call hotheads or bitter? Why are there so many activists thus with bullhorns sounding very angry and raised fists and look of rage on their faces? Is this then truth being communicated to conquer untruth? And if so, I'm not surprised then that it is getting basically nowhere, if not harming causes, harming even the whole idea of empathy being quite valuable and actually necessary to the continuance of our race. The question being then, what gives? Can truth win over untruth? Or as they shall say, good over evil, in one sense? Or you might even say, as Anne Schaaf says, from her Native American background, her having passed away a year or two ago, that many are addicts. Hence her book, When Society Becomes an Addict. And if so, then, maybe what we're talking about often is countering addicts with truth. And I'm referring particularly of what she called process addicts. And I'll just leave it at that right now. We're not talking thus chemically based addicts at all, but a whole other variety. And then basically this playing out as to what Dr. George Simon Jr. referred to as bad character. So if we were thus to try and combat bad character or addicts of a process nature, not drug nature, not chemical-based nature, with truth, then how come what we see all too often are those who are very angry, often violent even, with bullhorns, doing activism, and then sometimes being arrested and jailed. And occasionally they're hanging themselves, in fact, in jail out of fright before even a trial. Well, it seems to me that it's exactly this. Truth is not just saying something about the impact of one person upon another, but it's also conveying whether that person who had an impact chose to do it or couldn't help it. For if they chose to do it, we call this being a criminal. And if they didn't choose to do it, then I suppose you would simply call it a chain of events that was inevitable. And there then, to me, lies the crux of the issue. For I believe every activist, everyone trying to make social progress or progress to see people suffer less, is met up with a variety of words that they have to use almost. No choice, otherwise they won't be understood or be able to say anything. The words thus conveying, yes, a negative impact by one person upon another, but at another juncture saying that this impact was chosen, and thus the impactful person of a harmful nature was a criminal, basically, and is morally culpable in a court of law, etc., etc., and with spiritual implications too, as to punishment after death for those who have certain religious outlooks. So thus, to convey, as Gandhi had talked of, truth seems to me to be a double-edged sword if the truth has one element that is truthful and another element that is an untruth. And there lies the whole problem then. For our words, I believe, have often a double-edged aspect to them when it comes to people. Not objects, so to speak, of an inanimate nature, but people. And nobody wants to be told that they chose to do something very harmful when in fact they couldn't have done otherwise if you look at the whole chain of events involved. Hence the phrase I heard once, that some people in prison claim that they are innocent, regardless of what had actually happened, and they know it. The innocence they're claiming innocence because whatever did happen as to the influence they had was not chosen, they believe, and I believe accurately so, given all the chain of events involved. The environment, the possible genetics, especially to body type and gender, and thirdly, the words that they had available to process reality. For instance, Dr. David D. Burns, who wrote the book Feeling Good, has strongly urged that we not label people. And yet, if you don't use existing terminology to sort people out, what the Christian would say, winnow people into good and bad on the extremes, if you don't have terminology thus, then how can you sort people out, evaluate them? Hence a big problem. We're told not to label people, but then what terminology do you use? If it is always in the sense that something was chosen and thus a person is morally culpable, this in my mind is exactly what is termed a label, as opposed to a term, such as wanting to have a wall-painted pastel color of such and such. That is not a label, but a term. If we said, well, don't label walls because that's hurtful to the wall, well, then we wouldn't be able to select anything basically other than black and white. And yet when it comes to people, we seem to have a complete absence almost of terminology that does not imply choice. And thus, how can we say that we're combating untruth with truth when the words we say, once again, to imply someone's presence or impact is causing harm was chosen, and thus using label after label after label, as Dr. George, or rather David D. Burns, was talking about, a psychiatrist. In his book, I think about 1980 again, Feeling Good. So that, in my mind, is it in a nutshell here. We, as a human race, won't get anywhere addressing noxious influences on others unless we, yes, use truth against untruth or harmful influences, but we don't seem to have the tools presently available to speak truth in both the manner, or rather the impact on others, and how it is happening, not by choice, which is claiming thus that everybody harmful is a criminal, culpable, so to speak, when in fact, even fascinatingly, Dr. David Schwartz, in his book, The Magic of Thinking Big, back around 1960, he being a psychologist back then at the PhD level, having said that he sees no reason why human affairs, as he put it, is any different than anything else. I suppose, I don't know the exact words he used, but like a car engine. Human affairs, he referred to it, no different if you were to look at the whole chain of events, I would say. That was quite seminal, quite important, I think, what he said there. And I'll just leave it at that then. This is a very big topic. I believe it has held back mankind for the entire existence of mankind, and without change to our vocabulary, such that you might call it shifting to respectful language instead of condemnatory language in the moral sense, where someone is said to have chosen such and such in contradistinction to the chain of events. This will be problematic. For even in the court of law, some would wish to put out that there are extenuating circumstances. Well, what if extenuating circumstances are actually the chain of events? And that if you looked at the entire chain of events, the so-called extenuating circumstances would be so profound as to render any judgment in a court of law nothing more than penalties to try and impose upon the public sanctions against doing as someone might just feel like doing for short-term reasons. That to me then is a whole can of worms as to our legal system itself. Food for thought at any rate. Deep topic.